So as Mansour said in the introduction, my first book was called Colonial Land Policies in Palestine, 1917 to 1936. It was based on my PhD work, my DPhil work that I did in Oxford in the 1990s. In fact, it was 20 years ago today that I was doing research in the Israeli State Archives and living in a small little place in the old city just inside Newgate. And I haven't really been back since, so things have changed a great deal. So my next book, and I'll just sort of introduce this talk by saying this, I want my next book to be, and I don't know when it will be, it's called something like Colonial Land Policies in Egypt, 1880 to 1920. I see it almost as a prequel to my book on Palestine. What I realized is when I was looking at what the British were doing with the land regime here in Palestine in the 1920s, is that many officials who came from Egypt, and they pretty much did what they thought they were doing there. And their experience in Egypt, of course, drew on colonial experiences elsewhere, say in India in particular. So I thought I wanted to go back to do Egypt, and then will adopt a somewhat similar framework where I look at the actual categories of land policy that the British imposed themselves. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then if I were to complete the trilogy, I would write a book on colonial land policies in Jordan and Iraq, because it's pretty much the same person, and I'll talk a lot about this person. His name is Sir Ernest Else, who comes from Egypt, working on a land survey under Lord Cromer there. He comes to Palestine in the 1920s, is the main person who writes the legislation in the 1920s in Palestine. He does the same thing in Jordan, and Michael Fischbach has written about that. And then he goes to Iraq, and he tries to do the same thing in Iraq. And there's a very good book by Toby Dodge, who looks at land policies in Iraq. So we have here an interesting window into comparative work in comparative colonies in the the interwar period in the Middle East. Something which is very rarely done, actually. Not many people kind of work within their own national studies or country studies. So somebody will work on land in Iraq or Jordan or Palestine, but very few people draw comparative perspectives. So whether or not I actually ever get around to doing it, I hope somebody does, because more work needs to be done on comparative colonialisms. And that's just within the British. I mean, the British were aware of what the French were doing, and we just need to broaden this discussion out. Well, at least hopefully that's one of the conclusions I will draw here. So today I want to focus on that part of my work, which tries to understand how to really understand the land regime of Mandate Palestine. Most people who have written on this subject have really adopted what I consider sort of an approach of writing the Mandate period in a very backwards way. They look at 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel, and they try to say, well, what happened during the Mandate period to bring that about? And they really focus on Zionism as the engine of change. So that's one frame of reference. I'm not saying that should be discounted. But in addition to thinking of studying the Mandate period in terms of the Balfour Declaration and the Jewish national home, there are other frames of reference that we need to consider. One that I've already alluded to is the colonial frame of reference. To what extent did the British do here what they did in other colonies? They didn't just come in 1920 and said, uh-oh, this is different, somehow sui generis, we have to do things differently. They actually came and applied similar models from elsewhere. Now, what exactly a typical colony looks like is something we have to consider in more detail, but that would be the second frame of reference. And then the third frame of reference that I want to talk about, I should put this slide up, is the legacy of Ottoman state making. And this is something that very few people have actually considered. Most people look at 1914 or 1917 with the entry of the British into Mandate Palestine as a starting point. Right? I mean, I know we need starting points in history, but they don't look at the continuities from the Ottoman period. And even though the British, so when I say that the British came here and they did that which they did elsewhere in colonial situations, well, it was actually quite typically colonial to adapt to the administrative grid that was already there. Right? The British do not come in here with a completely new government and overhaul everything. So they have to work through administrative structures on the ground and political structures on the ground. Right? So they adopt a policy of, as elsewhere, indirect rule. where they look at the sorts of conservative forces on the ground that align themselves with the priorities of colonialism. And if they can't, then they'll invent them or they'll manipulate them. But there's a fair bit of working with what's available. So I'm going to consider these frames of reference. I argue that they're similar frames of reference that could be applied in other situations, but that when they're applied, one needs to be quite specific about the case study because it will work out differently in different areas. And of course, they're very overlapping, or they can be overlapping. So we have to try to understand that as well. And the case study I want to look at today is the 1928 Land Settlement Ordinance. Now, the 1928 Land Settlement Ordinance, I'll describe it in a minute, but this arguably be probably the most important piece of legislation ever passed by the British in Mandate Palestine. Okay, why am I making that claim? Because certainly with regard to land, this is a piece of legislation that would have mattered the most to most landholders in Palestine. Most landholders, many landholders, it could be said, would have come up and sort of come face to face with British officialdom through the Land Settlement Ordinance. They would have met the settlement officer. This is one of these instances where they would have been made very aware of colonialism in their midst. And secondly, land mattered here, right? It was a subsistence agricultural economy. The major source of wealth would have been land. And yet, in any other colonial situation, this would have been a subject of tremendous research and PhD theses. And nobody's really looked at it in the case of Mandate Palestine. Interesting. I'll have some ideas as to why. What do we mean by land settlement? This is a definition that's provided with sort of one of the big sources of British of information on British rule. It was a 2-volume survey of Palestine prepared for the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. This was a joint committee coming in after World War II to try to solve the problem of the growing ethnic conflict in Palestine. And they describe land settlement in these terms: the examination of rights to land and the solution of disputes about the ownership, boundaries, category, and other registrable rights in land. It's cadastral survey for the purpose and eventual recording of rights in land registers. I'll describe the process in more detail, but it's essentially they want to know who owns what. Right? And they want to send somebody into the field to figure this out. And where there's conflicts, as there's obviously going to be, people will say, well, no, wait a minute, I own that part and I own that part. They want to solve those problems. And then they say, and the emphasis is in the original in 1945, they say it must not be confused with the settlement of people on the land. So already, presumably at this time, people are starting to confuse this issue between settling rights to land, which the British wanted to do, and I'll explain why in 1928 this was the case. And then the extent to which people were also talking about the settlement of people on the land. And in this case in particular, the settlement of Jewish immigrants on the land. And they say it must not be confused with the settlement of people on the land. So if we're to kind of start the discussion of frames of reference, and I'll start with the frame of reference of the Balfour Declaration, the Jewish national home, the first question one would ask is, or should it? Because many people would argue that no, the 1928 Land Settlement Ordinance was very much about settling people on the land, about freeing up the market, putting land onto the land market through a process of land registration so that it could be more easily purchased by land purchasing agencies. Okay. But this is the question I really want to ask, right? Is should it or should it be confused with the settlement of people on the land? Before I do that, let's just take a look at what was meant by the whole process. Okay, as I suggested, if people can't see this very clear at the back, I will read through it. So we have this individual called Sir Ernest Else, and he comes to Palestine in the 1920s. He comes repeatedly over various visits, but at one point in 1927, he's actually assigned the position of Land Commissioner of Palestine, and he's really the author of this piece of legislation. And the way he puts it in his own writing, and he wrote copiously, report after report. He talks about land settlement, the settlement of title to land, as the blueprint for stability and prosperity. And he's drawing on his experience in Egypt, and then he comes to Palestine, and then he goes to Transjordan, and then he goes to Iraq. We've talked about that, right? But then he goes back to London, and he starts something called the Colonial Office Land Tenure Advisory Panel. like for him, this really is a blueprint. It's a colonial blueprint. I mean, he's very much part of the colonial machinery here, but he really sees it as a blueprint for prosperity and development everywhere. And he thinks he can reduce all of this to a little book that can fit into the back pocket of a colonial officer wherever they may be. Right? It could be Tanganyika, it could be Kenya, it could be the Seychelles, it could be Jamaica, or wherever. That's the idea. The Colonial Office Land Tenure Advisory Panel. He's a bit late here, though. It's like late 1930s, and World War II hits, and by the end of World War II, the empire begins its process of decolonization. So just when he's, aiming for this comparative practices of colonialism, the empire's on its way out in terms of that sort of direct control. But in Britain, I'll just finish the story because it's sort of an interesting one. He then, in 1952, authored the main text in London on land registration. And this remains the main text on land registration in England right up until the 1970s, when it's overhauled by a guy called Simpson at Cambridge University. And it's Cambridge University that then inherits the books and the maps and everything that the advisory panel had put together. And you can find parts of this in the Squire Law Library and the geography, and it's all been taken apart, the archive that they put together. But the point I want to make here is that Delston brought his ideas of a cadastral survey of the land, where everybody's plot of land would be measured and drawn and understood in relation to others, and the government would come up with some guarantee of that. He took that idea to England. It wasn't the other way around. England didn't have a cadastral survey. England didn't have that kind of system of land settlement. These are ideas that were being sort of explored, almost in turning Palestine into a bit of a laboratory to experiment on these ideas. And then the ideas are being returned to the metropole, to London. Now, whatever we think of Palestine as an experiment for these kinds of ideas, what's sort of interesting is that we sometimes think about land policies under colonial rule as being Britain imposing their ideas on the periphery. In fact, it's something more complex than that. Some of these ideas are being worked out in the periphery, in the empire, and then brought back to London. Very early on, I think I worked with a kind of a working title of British land policies in Palestine, and it occurred to me that that's actually quite wrong. That these weren't British ideas. Delston didn't really understand, didn't know what was happening in London at the time. 1925 was this massive agricultural land tenure act. The Colonial Office didn't pay attention to any of those things. They were much more aware of what's happening in other colonial situations. Okay, what was this blueprint? This will sound very familiar to us, right? Because it's very much part of what we would, what the IMF or the World Bank or American foreign policy in Iraq or something sees still today as a blueprint for prosperity. You, people who own land, you want to commodify that ownership now. You want to represent it as an asset, and to do so, you need a secure title to it. And if you have secure title to your land, then you can do things like go to a bank with it. A bank will take it as collateral and issue cheaper credit. If you don't have secure title to your land, the bank won't touch it, and you'd have to go to more expensive money markets. In the 1920s, it was these awful people called the money lenders, who charged high rates of interest. Right? They probably charged high rates of interest because they were also taking on huge risks. The banks didn't have the same amount of risk because these people had secure title. If they didn't pay it back, then they took ownership of the piece of land, right? And of course, if you got cheap credit, then you could invest in your land. Right? You could go. I mean, the major money to be made in an economy like Palestine was in the coastal plain, where you could plant oranges. But that was huge investment, right? You had to sit on that land for 7 or 8 years before you harvest your first orange. So you needed to kind of have access to credit. If you brought these assets into a market economy, then it was one way to find out that made sure that the people who wanted to invest in the land got access to the land. So you had the introduction of market economy into this. If you knew that you had accurate information about the land, then you made sure that it was taxed properly. It was taxed fairly, you knew who you were taxing, and you knew what you were taxing, and that benefited everybody. And the only way you would invest in your land, right, the only way you would actually, put manure in your land so that it would have a better harvest next year, or plant the seedlings of villages if you knew that that land was still going to be yours in 5 or 6 years' time. So if you had secure title to your land, you were more likely to invest in it than if title to the land was up for grabs. There was a book about, gosh, 10 or 15 years ago called The Mystery of Capital, Why the West Developed, or something of that sort. The mystery, Hernando de Soto, right? And you read the back jacket of that, and it's like everybody from Bill Clinton to the Washington Journal to Madeleine Albright. People love this book, right? And he essentially thinks he invented this idea, right? But it's classic Dowson. I once wrote an article from Dowson to De Soto. I mean, the title is the only good thing about the paper, but I thought I had something there. But this is in a colonial context, so it's going to be. I'll talk a little bit how it gets a bit more complicated for Dowson than it was for De Soto. How did Dowson suggest one do this? So the idea is that it had to be as comprehensive as possible, and it had to be organized by the government to be comprehensive. So what the 1928 Settlement of Title Ordinance does is it organizes a whole process of legal proceedings, well, administrative and legal proceedings. First, the surveyor would go into a village, understand the boundaries of the village lands, and then sketch out basically a cadastral map where you'd have geographical features represented on the map of the village lands, wadis or forests or the roads that might have bordered this land. And then they would sketch out the boundaries of the parcels. Now keep in mind just how dependent these surveyors would have been on the knowledge of the villagers themselves. They really just wanted as representative a map as possible. But the idea is you're now representing on a piece of paper what was a lived reality on the ground. Right? And these are processes of abstraction which can change the meanings of property at the same time as represent them. Second stage was that a settlement officer, so this again was a British officer, always a British officer, but now endowed with legal proceeding, like legal authority. And the settlement officer would go in with this sketch and then record on the parcels which sketched out the claims of the villagers. So he would sort out, well, who owns that parcel and who owns that parcel, and then also settle disputes between the two. And if there was anybody unrepresented who should have been there, and this could have been a minor or it could have been somebody who was absent or something of that sort, then those claims would have been represented by something called a village settlement committee. So a committee would be put together to represent the village concerns. So in all sorts of ways, I mean, the settlement officer has tremendous power, but he's also highly indebted to or dependent upon the knowledge of the village settlement committee. Now, we could think of this as being representative of the village, but it's not. Another way to think about this too, or maybe a more accurate would be, or at least be politically influential among them. Because I think there was all sorts of opportunity here for an individual to use their position on a village settlement committee to, put more land into their rights if somebody was absent or something of that sort. I mean, there are opportunities, what I'm trying to suggest, for the village settlement committees to manipulate rights in the village. It's sort of what I'm trying to suggest is that we also think about class, right, and elite politics in all of this at the same time. And finally, you have the map then, right? And on this map would be, and then you have a piece of paper. The map would have a sketch of the parcel. Every parcel would have a number on it. And then next to it, in a register on a piece of paper, so the map and then the register, you'd have that number. Every parcel has a number. In the register, every number has a entry in the register. And next to it, all the what they call registrable rights. The name, the boundaries of this land, the size of the land, what they grow, what the taxes are, these sorts of pieces of information. And then they would go back into the official government land registry. And after that, no transfer of land would be considered legal if it wasn't registered in that, because it had to be maintained up to date to have any use. But then you were issued with a title deed that gave you that reference back to that piece of land, back to that process. Okay. I'll go through this pretty quickly. How successful was it? In the 8-year period from 1928 to 1936, for all sorts of reasons, the governments weren't very happy with the progress of the land settlement process. We can talk a bit later about why this was the case. But when they compared this 8-year period of time to, say, a similar 8 years in Egypt and a similar 8 years in Jordan under similar practices, right, Palestine's actually pretty slow. Why? One reason that was given is that there was tremendous land speculation, right? Especially in the 1930s, you have a massive wave of immigration of Jewish immigrants coming from escaping Hitler's Germany after 1933. This was one of the really major waves of demographic increase in man-made Palestine. And this contributes to various Jewish land purchasing agencies competing with one another to purchase land. And so this meant that all sorts of land that possibly wouldn't have been claimed before is now claimed, and it was being claimed now, and that made the work of the settlement officer busier than expected. Fair to say, right? That is to say, if you're comparing Jordan with Palestine, and you're saying, well, look how many parcels were, look how much the size of the territory covered in Jordan compared with the size of the territory covered in Palestine, you're missing a lot if you're just comparing size. There are a number of smaller claims, more disputes around those claims in Palestine than in Jordan. And a lot of it had to do with the market. You had all sorts of issues when it came with Musha land. Musha land was land that was owned communally by the village. It wasn't common land. It's not land that anybody could use, like the commons or the tragedy of the commons in England. This was land that the village owned in common. And what they would do is there are various processes, but every year, or every couple of years, they would redistribute the land according to various mechanisms. It was a way of sharing village land, the risk and the opportunity of farming different types of land, and sharing that amongst all the villagers. What the settlement process wanted to do was stop that process and ensure that different people had their own plot, and they would stay with that plot, because then they're more likely to invest in it. Right? You're not going to invest in your land if you don't know that you'll be farming a different plot 3 or 4 years later. That became a process because they wanted to try to make that as they tried to engage in a process of land reform where they tried to make it more equitable. There are times when they run into what's called mafruz land, which is where the villagers themselves had already begun the process of privatizing title to village land, and that became even more confusing because of the way that the villagers had accomplished it. There were all sorts of technological limitations to the process. One of the problems was that it was the whole surveying, the technology of the surveying drew heavily from the experience in Egypt. But there you were looking at a delta and a river valley, all very flat land. That worked okay from the coastal plains, but as soon as you got into the hilly areas, it became more complicated in terms of the surveying equipment. Also, in terms of technological limitations, what becomes a real problem is, and I'm stalling here because I can't quite remember what it was I was going to talk about. I'll come back to it. The other problem is that you have in 1929 the Western Wall riots and then a series of demonstrations in the 1930s. When the British needed officers or soldiers, policing security to put those demonstrations down, they actually took the land surveyor officers, put a different uniform on them, and put a gun, and then they were sent into the field. Now, if you think about the degrees of trust required here, it's very difficult for a surveyor to be firing on the villagers 1 month and then going back into. So it wasn't just a question of settlement operations coming to a halt because they were distracted by other duties, or because you wouldn't go into the fields because it was dangerous in 1933. They pretty much shut down completely in 36 to 39 during the Arab Revolt. But that's also a big problem. But it does draw attention, right, to the extent to which these surveyors were dependent upon the goodwill of the villagers to make this work. And it had to work, right? You couldn't really make this stuff up. There's a tremendous literature coming out of the influence of Edward Said, where he talks about the extent to which things like census data or land registration data tells you more about European ideas of property than it does about the lived reality. And I think this is very true in terms of many representations. But in the case of land here, you couldn't just come up with a number and say, oh, you're paying this tax. Or you couldn't make up who owned what land, because it would fall apart. The idea was for it to be, if not some sort of dialogue between an official government and a population. Now, it's not to take power out of that relationship completely. I mean, the British officer had the legal powers, right? But they were highly dependent upon the local community too, or at least the politically influential among them. Okay, so if we think of settlement operations until 1936, this is kind of what I'm talking about. The whole pink area would have been subject to a process of triangulation, which gives the surveyors, the ones who go in for the sketches, they would have had some maps available also. There's a process of a fiscal survey that was done before the cadastral survey. The fiscal survey divided all the land into 10 different sections, or sort of 10 different types, 0 to 10. If it was a 10, it was like, you know, an orange orchard and taxed much more highly than 0, which would have not been taxed at all. And then the heavier red here on the coastal plain and some sections around Basin, that was the subject of the cadastral survey. And this is how much got done. This was the extent of the cadastral survey under 1928 land settlement operations up until 1936. So, what's going on here? So this is the case study I want to consider. What was Palestine here? Was it all about the Jewish national home? Or was it about colonialism? Or was it about an administrative grid that was already on the ground? I've tried this approach with other pieces of legislation, right? This is kind of, I think one has to be extremely specific about the circumstances in which to weigh these various issues. And then, you know, the argument would be, you could come up with a specific argument in terms of a specific context. So let's consider the Jewish national home. And invariably, the literature on Mandate Palestine suggests that it is about the Jewish national home. Right? That this is why Britain wanted to do something like the 1928 Land Settlement Ordinance, or any land settlement ordinance, is because Britain came here to promote the Jewish national home. And the Jewish national home was busy purchasing all the land. And this is what the British were doing. They wanted to get all the market, as much land into the market as possible to make it as easy as possible. And there is some truth to this, right? Obviously, the British are establishing the legal structure to make the market possible. There were Ottoman Empire had placed restrictions on Jewish land purchases. The British got rid of all of them. The British also passed other pieces of legislation aimed at trying to get the land into the market more easily. And also one needs to know that, of course, that in terms of immigration, for example, the whole umbrella framework of British security was key to Zionist immigration. I think where the British make the most important, contribution to Zionism in the interwar period, though, is around constitutional issues. Right? They pretty much allow the Jewish agency and the yeshuv to develop with its own political structures. Palestine is the one mandate, one colonial example that never gets its own legislative assembly. And so it's one of the very few mandates, or colonial arrangements, not to survive intact. But in land, so if we can distinguish land from immigration and constitutional issues, right? I'd actually suggest that land, we can actually mitigate. We can actually suggest that the Jewish national home was not a particularly important motivation for land policies. Why? The most obvious, the largest one is that only approximately 7% of Mandate Palestine was purchased by the Jewish national land purchasing agencies in the Mandate period. And some of that, I think maybe 2 or something, a significant proportion of that 7% was purchased before the British got there, under the Ottoman regime. The big Sursak deal in the Marj ibn Ammar, or Australian Valley, that was all begun under the Ottoman Empire. Now, if we look at Dowson and his priorities, right, it really isn't at all clear. Well, first of all, it's Dowson. Many people who say, well, everything to do with land policies is, of course, due to the Jewish national home, because Herbert Samuel, the first High Commissioner, was a Zionist, and his Attorney General, Norman Bentwich, was a Zionist. Bentwich didn't have anything to do with the drafting of the 1928 Land Settlement Ordinance. It really was all about Dowson. And if you think about Delson's priorities, just to give you an example from his reports, oh goodness, we can't see this, right? But this is one report, and this is a table of contents, and it's done by actual chapter headings. And somewhere down here, and I can't even read it, but I remember what it looks like. You'll have to trust me on this. This chapter here, I think it's 16, it's called Colony Records. And in the paragraphs under that chapter of colony records, he talks about the Jewish colonies, which had their own system of land registration, and he wanted to absorb them. But he also talks about German colonies, say around Jerusalem. So why I like this image is that for Delson, the Jewish colonies were sort of a footnote or a subheading in the larger issue of land policies. Whereas the extant literature, the secondary literature, sort of turned that on the head and turned British colonial land policies into a subheading of Zionism and Jewish national home. Okay, and keep in mind this is 1920. This is before the Western Wall riots of 1929. Later, when he's actually pulled on the carpet by the Peel Commission, which is very unhappy about the progress of land settlement. But keep in mind, the Peel Commission came in 1937 to try to assess the causes of the 1936 outbreak. And so their whole perspective was to look at not whether or not policies, they say this, it wasn't about whether or not policies were good or bad, it was whether or not they contributed to the conflict between Jew and Arab. And Delson's response was, this had nothing to do with that. He says in 1938, he says this, right? It would have been just as necessary if the Balfour Declaration had never been conceived. Now I know, do we take him at face value? And I'll say a bit more about this when we talk about colonial perspectives.
Sorry, you repeat this.
Sorry?
He regrets the Balfour Declaration?
No, he says that it would have been just as necessary if the Balfour Declaration had never been conceived. The land settlement ordinance. What about this as a case study of a settler state, right? Because settler colonialism has proved to be a very, very useful framework for understanding other aspects of of Zionism, in particular labor, right? And here I'm thinking of the work of Gershon Shafir, Zach Lockman, and Oren as well. And this makes sense. And also questions of citizenship. So again, when we come down to questions of constitutional issues or immigration, land, less easy. Okay, I'll make the mistake of drawing the comparison of Algeria. I say this because Algeria is not necessarily a good case study of a settler state. But if you look at what the, and we can do this beyond it. If you look at what the British government did in Australia to help settlers, or what they did in Canada to help settlers, or what the French do in Algeria to help settlers, right? Or if you look at what the Dutch access to the land regime. I mean, they went out of their way to manipulate whatever legal processes are possible, to expropriate and appropriate as much land as possible, right? And either give it to the settlers, right, or get it onto the market and sell it cheap. This the British did not do in Palestine, right? And Zionism is furious about it. Right? Jabotinsky, at one point in the 1920s, this thinks that British they've completely betrayed their obligation to Zionism by the terms of the Balfour Declaration, written into the terms of the mandate. One of the big issues was around state lands. It's written into the mandate. It's written into the document, right? That Britain was supposed to facilitate the Jewish acquisition of state lands. The problem in Palestine is that whoever wrote that line didn't really have a clue what Palestine land was about. There weren't state lands in Palestine the way that the mandate assumed. And to the extent that Britain could try to acquire control over land in this regard, they discovered, well, there was no such land available. It was all inhabited, and these inhabitants had rights to the land. And whether it was a case of maybe late colonialism, or maybe it was a feeling that Britain actually did feel a dual obligation, that there was an obligation to the peasantry as well as to Zionism, they weren't prepared to go in and dispossess the Arab inhabitants of state land on behalf of Zionism. Zionists were furious with this, but nonetheless they weren't going to do it. In part because what happens to a dispossessed landholder? They make their way in the British idiom. Well, they do, but the big fear in the mind of the British officer is that they make their way to the shanty towns of Haifa, and are more likely to engage in civil unrest. And that costs money to put down. Right? If there's a golden rule of colonialism, right, the British taxpayer cannot pay for it. It has to pay for it. It has to be run on the cheap. Here, this is an important issue, I think, is when we think of the Land Settlement Ordinance, when we think of a government securing title to the land in the name of the landholder. Right? Yes, this empowers the government. Right? It's the state that has a representative, the British surveyor, in the village, right, and defining these new rules. So it is extending the power of the government. But one could also argue that this whole process of registering land does empower the landholder at the same time. Let's give some examples of this. When journalists, say, I'm thinking of Robert Fisk of The Independent in the 1980s, went into the refugee camps of southern Lebanon, and he writes about this in Pity the Nation, in a chapter called The Keys of Palestine. He's presented almost by everybody with a box, inside of which is the key to their house, and underneath that is the title deed to their home. And that title deed is stamped Government of Palestine. That title deed is emerged from this process. So these pieces of paper really are worth their weight in gold to the landholder who has this title as well as to the government in terms of having information about it. I'd argue that the village settlement committees, at least in terms of what the official records tell us, participated in this process, contributed to this process. Right? They wanted secure title to the land. One other aspect to consider in all of this is if we were to compare British colonialism in Mandate Palestine with what can be referred to as Israeli colonialism in the West Bank, right, after 1967, keep in mind that between 1948 and 1967, the Jordanians ruling the West Bank continued the process of land registration under similar terms. After 1967, Israel shuts it down. Right? They stopped the process because, from Israel's point of view, ambiguity over land rights in those areas that are not settled was more conducive to a process of annexing, appropriating property than running into land that was already surveyed. And Raja Shahade has talked about, land registration offices being burned down mysteriously. So there is a sense in which Israel would have benefited from the lack of registration in the West Bank. And I guess to see this kind of in another way, it's that Palestinians would benefit or in a better position to defend themselves against Israeli expropriation policies in the West Bank if they have that title deed.
And most notably,
right, yeah. And the last part I wanted to make here was the fan-like nature of settlement operations. That when people consider settlement operations, right, they put the map up here and notice a heavy emphasis on the coastal plain, and then this map shows Jewish land purchases. Heavy emphasis on the coastal plain, and then this inland valley. That famous end, right, that essentially gives rise to the UN partition plan of 1947. So they say, how can it not be connected? And so they point to this and they say, that's why the British concentrated all their efforts here was to support Jewish land purchases. And it does. I think, yes, they could benefit from some ambiguity, and they do. If you look at the Sursock land deal, this massive deal in the Marj ibn Ammar, or the Wadi Hararat lands in the coast, there are all sorts of inhabitants of villages caught up in those land sales who actually had claims to the land, but they couldn't press them because they didn't have the proof that they needed to. Okay. Mind you, at the same time, Jewish land purchasing agencies were more than happy to buy registered land because then they also got the security of title that came with it if it was already registered. But to get back to the fan-like nature, in the records, I couldn't find any kind of smoking gun that says we have to do it this way because we have to benefit the Jewish national home because of our promises. What Delson said is we need two settlement parties, and by starting in the coastal plain with their back to the sea, they could, and going out in a fan-like motion, they could be as comprehensive as possible. You do one village, and then you do the neighboring village, and the neighboring village, because that way you know that the whole grid will match up. They were adamant that they were not going to go do some land here, do some land here, do some land here, because then there was no guarantee that when one settled village came up against another settled village, that they will actually match up. So they had to do a fan-like motion. It was going to concentrate on the coastal plains because that's where the technology was. That's what they knew how to do based upon the very same process in Egypt. And you went out in a fan-like motion. Okay, how am I doing for time? Okay, I'll be repeating a fair bit of stuff now, so that and as I say, these sorts of frames of reference are meant to be overlapping. So to some extent, it's about the Jewish national home, but also to some extent, I think, it's fairly put. The Delson may well have come in 1928 and passed a similar piece of legislation. And one piece of evidence for this is that he goes from Palestine and does the very same thing in Jordan, where there is no pressure for the Jewish national home. And was actually quite successful. Well, by successful, I mean the powers that be think it's successful. Whether or not it was successful for, well, we'll talk about some of the, but I have to be very careful here. I'm not trying to promote land settlement and a private property approach to economic development, right? That's not my when I say success or not success, but it didn't encounter huge obstacles in Jordan. So part of seeing Palestine as a colony is to understand the extent to which ideologies and templates were borrowed from other areas. So, for example, in terms of ideology, this was an ideology in terms of this sort of capitalist notion of development that was explored elsewhere, in Egypt, in India. Right? This is an ideology that was carried around through the empire. So too were templates. That when the 1928 Land Settlement Ordinance was drawn up, and this is the same case with the Forestry Ordinance in the 1920s, and I can give you some other examples of Surveying Ordinance, all of these ordinances drew on other imperial ordinances. Right? They would draw on Cyprus, they would draw on Egypt, they would draw on Tanganyika, they would draw on the Malay Straits. There's just a kind of an infrastructure out there of colonial laws that were drawn upon. Sudan. The Sudan Land Ordinance of 1905 plays a very important role here too in the 1928 Land Settlement Ordinance. Okay. Having said that, we have to be very careful. There was no typical colonial rule. This is the thing about colonialism, is that it could be so ad hoc, so makeshift, so contradictory. It's very hard to find a neat narrative in colonial rule, because so often it could be very muddy, very messy. It was internally contradictory. You had the Prime Minister's office saying one thing, but the Colonial Office would say something else. The Treasury certainly cared about what was going on at the same time. And then the Foreign Office had, or the War Office, depending on the time period. But that's just London, right? And then you had Jerusalem worried about one thing, and then district commissioners and men on the spot doing something quite different. So it was often going in different directions. Also, colonialism itself could really didn't know what it wanted to do. It knew that it had to run things on the cheap, but if you're going to do that, then you're really dependent upon indirect rule. You're really dependent upon alliances on the ground. Right? One historian actually refers to colonialism as, best in terms of generalizing, it was a mechanism for managing contradictions. The great contradiction here in Palestine, as elsewhere, is that, well, on the one hand, you were committed to this whole notion of a free market. And from a colonial ideological point of view, it's so interesting when you read the documents of colonialism, they spend a large portion of their energy just defending colonialism, justifying colonialism. Right? And a key aspect of justifying colonialism was private property. If you could set out yourself as, the inventor of private property, this wonderful gift for the development of the 19th century economic development, and this was your gift that you are now presenting to the world, well, of course we're supposed to be here colonizing you. But all of that, keep in mind, depended upon a portrayal of the colonized as being backward, so backward, and the backwardness itself was defined by the absence of private property. This is where Edward Said's formulations coming quite helpful. The representation of the colonized was as other, right? And if Britain's about private property, then the Ottoman Empire was often almost always portrayed in their mind as not about private property. That's how it's portrayed. So on one hand, it's about the free market, but then it's also very much about a stable peasantry. So when the free market is being used as destabilizing the peasantry, why? Because people are, maybe they are going to the bank and they're taking out loans, but in the minds of the British, they're not spending that money properly, and then they go into debt, and then they lose their land. Right? That's the argument of secure title. If you can secure title, then you can also lose it. Whereas if you don't have secure title, then it's very difficult to lose it, because who do you lose it to? And the idea of a stable peasantry is very, very important to colonialism. They did not like the idea of having to spend money on raising forces to put down the demonstrations. So broadly, generally, if the 1920s, and keep in mind Dowson was 1928, was about free market and economic development, the 1929 Western Wall riots, and then again in 31 and 33 and 36, the 1930s were more about the stable peasantry. And you have ordinance after ordinance, 1931, 33, 36, aimed at keeping the peasantry on the land. And the 36 legislation, called Lot Viable, basically said, no, everybody who owns a certain amount of land that is necessary for their sustenance, they cannot sell that. There's a minimum area that you cannot sell. And nothing new there. There's the 5 Fadan law in Egypt in 1912, which itself was based on the Punjab Land Alienation Act of 1898. So these contradictions are inherent to British rule from the beginning. Right? It's not really a transfer of free market to stable peasantry. Because even the Land Transfer Ordinance of 1920-21 had a clause in it that talked about protecting the peasantry. So all sorts of contradictions and paradoxes of colonial rule. And then also to find out that in terms of doing something new, well, part of colonial rule was about indirect rule, and you were already so dependent upon local alliances. Part of this was, as I've already talked about, village settlement committees. Part of this, though, is probably really a commitment to the large landowners, what we called in the early 1990s the politics of the notables, the notable families who play a really important role. And finally, and this will take me to the last one, Ottoman legislation. And what they find is, despite all of the rhetoric, and you find it in Dowson, around the evils of Ottoman rule and the backwardness of Ottoman rule. Grass does not grow where the Turk trod, or something like that. Right? I mean, but you needed to. They needed to vilify the Ottoman Empire in order to justify their rule. And the 4-year period of war made it easy to do so, especially towards the end of the war, when you think about what the Ottoman leaders, Kemal Pasha and others, were doing to the Arab populations. But the truth is that the Ottoman Empire had already initiated a process very similar to what Dowson had already taught it was about. And in the 1930s, he actually begins to appreciate this in his reports. I'm going to draw mostly on the work of Martin Bunton and her husband, Richard Salmery Smith, who have looked more into Ottoman rule in the Arab provinces than anyone else I know. And what they actually conclude is that Dowson's blueprint here he didn't invent this, right? This was around. The idea of ownership of rights to land was well known in many parts of the world. And in fact, quite similar to an Ottoman blueprint that began in 1858 with the Land Code. A process of legislation that continues in the 1870s and completes itself in about 1912, where essentially the Ottomans had decreed a cadastral survey on European models. And so what they're talking about in models there in terms of the technology. So this was being done already. Now it wasn't being done, I'm not saying it's being done in an efficient way, it was a very haphazard way, and it was only just initiated. Most land had not been cadastrally surveyed, but there had been some surveys in different areas. Their conclusion here is British officials under the mandate in Palestine and Jordan were to implement a similar program, but were to celebrate their land registration, not as part of any legal responsibilities to apply Ottoman law, but as evidence of the progress in civilization that European forms. I'm properly represented. So where does this leave us? What I'm sort of trying to suggest is that, if we're to kind of look at why the 1928 Land Settlement Ordinance was issued, I'd suggest that the major impetus here came from the fact that there was an Ottoman grid on the ground, that the big intervention on the part of the British would have been to not have passed a piece of legislation like that, rather than to have passed it. That Ottoman law was overlapping with colonial policies or ideals, at least at this time in 1928. Right? And that Zionism was actually, yes, it did benefit from it, but it was actually kind of one of the less important influences on this piece of legislation. But what I also want to suggest is that when we think about land and property, all I'm talking about here is the legislative process. It's one thing for the British to write up this law, but when we think about property, the way Martin Bunton and Richard Sommer Smith talk about it, but it also goes into legal geographers, is property is really articulated at several points. One is the writing of the legislation, but the second point would be the implementation of that legislation on the ground. And then the third would be the understandings that these people now take from that process. And there's, of course, no guarantee that as policy turns into law and then is implemented on the ground, that they end up with the same thing that they started with. Right? So that in terms of the work that still needs to be done, and I think it's starting to be done, is to actually take a look at that settlement process at the village level. And I think these diaries of the settlement officers and the records of the settlement process do exist, and to actually find out what was happening at the local level. And what role did the British surveyor play? Let me just give a couple of examples here. Right? But the lived reality of these rights that were being sorted out at a village level. What I mean by lived reality is there are going to be disputes, right? People have to work out who owned what. But often it would have been defined in very certain terms, right? I own the land from that wadi to the forest, or from the hill to the road. And even within that, it wouldn't have been I own that rectangle or triangle or octagonal piece or something like that. It would have been a question of owning the rights to the harvest of whatever wheat grew that year, depending upon the rainfall. Right? It would have been a question of harvest of the land rather than the land itself as a commodity. And for that matter, somebody might have owned the olives from the tree, but somebody else might have owned the wheat that grew underneath the tree, and somebody else would have had rights to the stubble after the wheat was harvested to herding their goats. So there are all sorts of multiple ways of understanding property from a lived reality that are now being understood in much more abstract terms. If you consider some of the definitions that were used at the time, like fadan or jiflik, those translations are a fadan or a jiflik is the amount of land that 2 oxen can plow in a day or something of that sort. And what you find is that a fadan in southern Palestine is a very different amount than in northern Palestine. So what this process is doing is taking very lived notions of property rights and centralizing them, standardizing them. So there really is a process of change going on here. Right? And the role of the survey officer could be, I think, quite manipulative at sometimes, but at other times just so highly dependent upon the politics on the ground. And there's wonderful examples of the surveyors just being hoodwinked almost. People would dig up trees and plant them the day before the surveyor would come to prove that they've had this long-term access. So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing we have to realize that's going on here is it's a very simplified notion of property. As far as the British are concerned at this point, it's either private property or it's state regulation. There's no room for the commons here. They hate the idea of village, communal land. So everything is either divided up into rectangles and given in one person's name, or the state is trying to take control over it. But that's something that's happening across the world at this time, right? And maybe reaching its apogee in 1970s, 1980s. And it's only recently that there's actually a wonderful body of literature emerging from especially from the impact of people like Elinor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize 5-10 years ago. And she's led a real effort to reclaim an understanding of the commons as a legitimate form of property, and possibly, the most environmentally sustainable one, where we try to reclaim a common property. To the extent that that can be, that's part of the British imperial strategy to think in those terms, but there's also post-Enlightenment, modernity, other ways of understanding what's happening in that regard as well. Okay, thank you very much. I think I've spoken for too long.